Hello. Imagine you read this headline. People who eat breakfast every day are 20% less likely to be depressed. It sounds like useful advice. Eat breakfast, feel better. But before you change your morning routine, ask one question. How did they learn that? Did they watch what people already do? Or did they change what people do and measure what happened? That distinction between observing the world and intervening in it is the most important distinction in research design. In weeks 2 and 3, we built tools for thinking about causation and measurement. Today, we step back and ask a more foundational question. What kinds of research designs allow us to draw what kinds of conclusions? Because two studies can both be careful, well conducted, statistically sound, and yet one justifies a causal claim and the other absolutely does not. The difference is the design. Let's start with observation. In research design, an observational study is one in which the researcher records what happens without intervening to change it. There's no manipulation, no assignment to conditions, no treatment introduced by the researcher. The world unfolds. The researcher measures. This covers a wide range of methods. Naturalistic observation, watching behavior in real settings. Structured observation, observing in controlled environments without manipulating anything. Case studies, deep examination of a single person or event. Longitudinal research, tracking the same people or phenomena across time. And then there's the method you'll encounter more than any other in psychology, and that's self-report. Surveys, questionnaires, rating scales, these are the workhorses of psychological research. The vast majority of studies you'll read this semester collected their data by asking people to report on their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. There are good reasons for that. Self-report is efficient. You can collect data from hundreds of people in minutes. It's often the only access point we have. You can't observe someone's mood from the outside the way you can observe their behavior. And for many constructs, attitudes, beliefs, subjective well-being, the person's own report is the phenomenon. But self-report comes with specific vulnerabilities you need to know about, like social desirability. People tend to present themselves favorably. If you ask, how often do you exercise? People systematically overestimate. If you ask about prejudice, people systematically underreport. And then there's memory distortion. When you ask someone to recall the past week or month, they're not playing back a recording, they're reconstructing, and reconstruction is shaped by current mood, expectations, and the way the question is framed. And there's a gap between perception and behavior. What people think they do and what they actually do are often different. Students who report, I study about 20 hours a week, frequently study far less when tracked objectively. This isn't dishonesty, it's the nature of self-report. Then there's question design effects. How you word a question shapes what you measure. Asking, how happy are you versus how satisfied are you with your life produces different answers about ostensibly the same construct, which connects directly to the operationalization problem from week 3. None of this means self-report data are worthless. It means you should always ask, what are the specific strengths and vulnerabilities of this method of data collection for this construct? All observational methods, including self-report, share one defining structural feature. The researcher does not create the independent variable. They measure what already exists. It's tempting to treat observation as second-rate science. That would be a mistake. Observation has real strengths. Ecological validity. You capture behavior as it actually happens, not under artificial lab conditions, not under contrived instructions, real life. Ethics and feasibility. You cannot randomly assign people to poverty, trauma, discrimination, or childhood adversity. For many of the most important questions in psychology, observation is not optional. It's the only ethical path. Discovery. Observation is how science generates questions. Before you can test something experimentally, you need to notice it. Observation is often where science begins. But here's the structural limitation. Suppose a survey finds people who exercise more report lower depression. This is an observational finding. It's real. It may replicate. But can we conclude that exercise reduces depression? Not from this alone. Because the groups differ in more ways than just exercise. People who exercise regularly may also sleep better, earn more, be more conscientious, have stronger social networks. These are confounders, variables that differ between groups and could explain the association. Even if you statistically adjust for the confounders you measured, you can never be sure you've caught them all. There are always unmeasured variables, imperfect measurements, unknown influences. And this is the structural limitation of observation. It gives you association. Causation, though, requires something more. In week 2, we introduced 3 features that give experiments their causal power: manipulation, comparison, and random assignment. I'm not going to reteach those today. You know them. What I want you to see now is why they exist, what specific problem each one solves in the logic of evidence. Manipulation. It solves the direction problem. When the researcher creates the independent variable, introduces a treatment, sets a condition, the outcome cannot have caused the manipulation. Cause comes first, effect comes second. Comparison solves the counterfactual problem. You need a control condition to approximate what would have happened without the treatment. Without comparison, you can't distinguish the effect of your manipulation from everything else that was happening. And random assignment solves the confounding problem. When participants are assigned to conditions by chance, pre-existing differences get distributed across groups rather than concentrated in one. The link between who you are and what condition you're in gets broken. Together, these 3 features are why experiments support causal inference. Not because experiments are inherently superior, but because they structurally address the specific threats that make causal claims hard. And notice what this framing gives you: a way to see observation and experimentation not as bad and good, but as designs that address different threats and therefore earn different conclusions. Let's go back to the breakfast headline. People who eat breakfast every day are 20% less likely to be depressed. The observational version. Survey a large sample, ask how often they eat breakfast. Measure depressive symptoms with a questionnaire. Find an association. Regular breakfast eaters report fewer symptoms. What can you conclude? That breakfast eating and lower depression go together in this sample. That's it. Why not more? Because breakfast eaters might differ in dozens of ways: income, employment, sleep habits, family stability, physical health, and any of those could explain the association. And notice the depression measure is self-report, which means it carries all the vulnerabilities we just discussed, including social desirability, memory reconstruction, question framing. And then consider the experimental version. Recruit participants, randomly assign half to eat breakfast every morning for 8 weeks. The other half maintains their existing routine. Measure depressive symptoms before and after. Now, if the breakfast group improves more, the causal story is stronger. Random assignment balances confounders. Manipulation ensures direction. Comparison provides the counterfactual. But even this experiment has limits. It tells you whether this intervention, eating breakfast for 8 weeks, changed this outcome, scores on this depression questionnaire in this sample. It doesn't tell you whether the effect lasts. It doesn't tell you which component of breakfast mattered. It doesn't tell you whether the result generalizes to people with clinical depression, or to different cultures, or to different breakfast foods. Every design answers a specific question, and nothing more. This brings us to one of the most important tensions in research design. Internal validity. Confidence that the manipulation caused the outcome. External validity. Confidence that the findings generalize beyond the study. These often pull in opposite directions. A tightly controlled lab experiment can have high internal validity. You're confident about the cause and effect, but potentially low ecological realism. The setting is artificial. The task is contrived. The participants are maybe psychology undergraduates. Whether the result holds outside that context is an open decision. A naturalistic observational study can have high ecological validity. That is, you're studying real behavior and real contexts, but lower causal certainty. And you can't rule out confounders, and you can't establish direction. So the more control you introduce, the more artificial the situation can become. The more natural you make the situation, the harder it is to rule out the alternatives. This is not a flaw in psychology. It's a structural trade-off in empirical science. And mature research programs don't rely on one design. They triangulate. They use experiments, longitudinal observation, naturalistic studies, and replication across contexts. When multiple designs converge on the same conclusion, confidence increases, not because any single study was perfect, but because the different designs have different weaknesses. Here's a quick check. A lab experiment finds that a brief mindfulness exercise reduces self-reported anxiety. A large longitudinal survey finds that people who practice mindfulness regularly report less anxiety over time. Neither study alone is conclusive, but what does convergence across the two designs buy you? The experiment has internal validity, but limited ecological realism. The observational study has ecological validity, but can't establish causation. When both point in the same direction, the strengths of each compensate for the weakness of the other. That's triangulation. Here's a principle that sounds simple, but will change how you read research. Different designs answer different questions. If your question is, what does this phenomenon look like? You need descriptive observation. If your question is, are these two things related? You need a correlational or survey design. If your question is, does X cause Y? You need an experiment. If your question is, how does this develop over time? You need longitudinal research. If your question is, does this hold in other contexts? You need replication and variation. No single design is best. Each decision earns specific conclusions and nothing more. And notice what this means for how you evaluate research. The first question is never, is this a good study? The first question is, what question is this study designed to answer? And does the design actually support the answer being claimed? Sometimes a descriptive study is exactly what's needed. Sometimes a massive randomized trial is answering the wrong question. Design quality is always relative to purpose. Here is the principle I want you to remember from this lecture. The design of a study determines what conclusions are justified. Not the sample size, not the complexity of the statistics, not the prestige of the journal. The design. An observational study, no matter how large, no matter how well measured, cannot justify a causal claim on its own. A laboratory experiment cannot automatically justify generalization to the real world. A self-report questionnaire cannot stand in for behavior without an argument for why it should. Every design has strengths. Every design has blind spots. And self-report, the method that you'll encounter probably most often in psychology, has specific vulnerabilities that you know now to look for. Social desirability, memory distortion, the gap between what people report and what they do, and the way question wording shapes responses. Scientific knowledge grows not from any single perfect study, but from the accumulation of imperfect studies whose weaknesses don't overlap. Next, we're going to build a diagnostic toolkit, a set of questions you can apply to any study to figure out what it can and can't tell you. And we're going to test it against something deceptively simple. You've been asked to read about the pitch drop experiment here at the University of Queensland. It's often called the world's longest running experiment. But is it actually an experiment? Does it involve manipulation, comparison, random assignment? Or is it something else entirely? And if so, what kind of conclusions does it earn? Hold that question. We'll come back to it. And I hope that you'll actually go and visit the pitch drop experiment if it's possible for you to do so. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.